All right, everyone, let's get this build started. So this is gonna be chapter 1 of my 2.5 MFI motor build. This is the motor that's gonna go into my 1972 Porsche 911T hot rod. And to start, we're gonna begin with a crankshaft assembly. For the crankshaft, I decided to keep the stock crankshaft that came out of the 2.4. It's all been gone through, so it's good to go for a fresh build here. All the journals have been polished, they've all been measured, they're all within spec for standard size bearings. It's been balanced, it's been cross drilled, it's good to go. All right, so the other part I've got here is the flywheel, and it's also been machined and balanced, but the only reason the flywheel is out this early in the process is because I'm going to be using this to support the crankshaft as we mount the rods. So, mount the crankshaft on here. It'll act as a platform or to stabilize the crank, and we'll bolt on the rods. Okay, so for rods, going with the stock 2.4 rods, again, these came out of my motor when I tore it down. They've been gone through, right? So they've been rebushed, they've been balanced, and everything's been measured to ensure that they're all within spec. Couple upgrades though, couple upgrades for the rods. First being, I will be going with ARP rod bolts and nuts in place of the stock hardware. And bearings. Also upgrading the rod bearings. So going with rod bearings that were done by Auto Associates out in Canton, Connecticut. Great shop if you're ever out that way, check them out. But these are Malclevite bearings that have the calico coating on them. So couple upgrades for the rods. I am building a motor to run at a little higher RPM than it was originally produced for. And it's going to put out more power than it was originally putting out when it was stock. So I think these are a couple important upgrades to make sure that things work well inside the motor. All right, so a few other things here. We've got assembly lube. Gonna need a ton of this stuff over the next few days or weeks, however long it's gonna take me to build this motor. I've never done this before. Anyway, so gotta have that stuff on hand. Loctite 271. This is what's gonna be used for the nuts, the rod bolt nuts, okay? Plasti-Gauge. I'll talk about this in the video, but I used Plasti-Gauge to check the bearing clearances. I wanted to make sure that everything measured out to spec as it should. Now, as I mentioned, I had all of my machine work done by a very reputable machine shop. I probably could have bolted all of this stuff up and been fine, but as you'll see, I went through and made sure that I checked the clearance to make sure that they were all within spec. Now to do that, I kept the stock rod bolts. As you know, rod bolts are made to be used one time, right? Once you torque them down, they're stretched and they're not intended to be removed and retorqued and reused, right? You certainly don't want one of these to come loose inside your motor. So I kept those, and those are what I used to dry fit all of the rods along the crank using Plasti-Gauge to measure clearance. So again, we'll get into that in the video, but don't toss those things when you're tearing your motor down if you're interested in checking the clearance. All right, so with that, let's get started. Here's a look at the Plasti-Gauge packaging. There's different colors. I know there's at least green and red. Make sure you get green. It needs to measure 0.001 to 0.003 inches. This is what the Plasti-Gauge looks like. I've cut a small enough piece just long enough to lay across the width of one of the rod bearings. Take this bottom half of the rod, grab the top half of the rod, and carefully attach them to the crankshaft without the Plasti-Gauge piece falling out. When you're assembling the rods, make sure that you're selecting the matching pieces. The bottom half of the rod and the top half of the rod should have numbers that match. Carefully torque down the rod bolts without allowing the rod to move. For stock bolts, it requires 14.7 foot-pounds plus an additional turn of 90 degrees. Remove the rod from the crankshaft carefully, not allowing it to move. Once you remove the rod, you'll see the plastic gauge has been squished onto the bearing surface. This is where you're going to measure your clearance. The clearance should be 0.030 to 0.088 millimeters. All right, everything checked out according to spec. It's time to put this crankshaft together. So I had my son help support the crankshaft while I bolted on the flywheel. With the flywheel attached, it's now time to turn this crankshaft over and begin the assembly. Careful, this thing is really heavy. Parts came back from the machine shop very clean. However, I used Kimtech Science brand wipes to wipe down the surfaces of the crankshaft. That includes all the bearing journals, as well as the inside surface of both rod ends, as well as once you press the bearing in, the bearing surface of each side of the rod ends. My parts were clean enough just to use simple rubbing alcohol on the wipes. With all the bearing journals and bearings clean, it's time to start attaching the rods to the crankshaft. Start by applying assembly lube to the bearing surface. Use your finger to spread an even coat across the entire surface. You don't want it to be too much, but certainly make sure all of the area is covered with assembly lube. Take the rod in, slide it across one of the journals, then grab the other end of the rod and do the same thing. You basically just want to make sure that you've covered the surface area of the bearings with a good amount of assembly lube. Now insert your rod bolts. You just want to make sure that they're finger tight at this point. I'm using ARP rod bolts, which require assembly lube. These rod bolts do not require Loctite. In fact, it would interfere with getting a proper torque on these bolts. So you apply a generous amount of the assembly lube from ARP directly on the threads of the rod bolt, as well as on the surface or the face of the nut. Okay, now let's repeat that process 6 times. Now it's time to start to torque down the rod bolts. I ended up using both a torque wrench as well as a bolt stretch gauge. ARP recommends the stretch method for ensuring proper torque. I ended up doing both. So for stretch, they recommend the bolts be stretched to 0.0095 to 0.0100 in length, stretch length. As far as the torque goes, they recommend 50 foot-pounds of torque. The process that I would use is I would gently torque down the bolts, approaching 50 foot-pounds. So when I got to around 40 foot-pounds of torque, I would start measuring the stretch of the bolt. I use a simple beam-type torque wrench, maybe not the most precise, so I wanted to make sure that I didn't torque it down all the way to 50 foot-pounds and then try to take a stretch measurement. It actually ended up being very close. Using the torque wrench, once I got to 50 foot-pounds of torque, it was pretty close with each bolt in terms of getting it within that range of stretch. However, with each bolt, I set everything based on the stretch measurement. All right, so with all the rod bolts tightened up, here's a little trick that you can do. You can put the crankshaft on its side and let the rods rotate down under their own weight. They should all move very smoothly. There should be no catching, and they should all move at roughly the same rate. All right, so the crankshaft assembly is good to go. I've got all the rods attached to the crank. The rod bolts have been tightened down to 50 foot-pounds of torque based on specifications from ARP. Also used a stretch gauge to ensure that the bolts were within specification from a stretch perspective, and pretty well lined up. Just torquing them down with a torque wrench, pretty darn close to getting it within stretch range just by getting it in at the torque setting, but I did use the stretch measurement as the final adjustment. Anyway, so here she is. You can see on the rods, where they've been balanced, right? So here on the edge, you see how some material's been removed there. That was done by ollies to balance the rods. You can see also up here, some material removed here from this rod. Obviously each one of them are a little bit different in terms of how much material was removed. Like look at this rod, right? These edges are sharp. Nothing was removed from those edges. Although there was something removed from, the nose of the rod here. So pretty cool, to see the work done by ollies to make sure that these were all balanced. It's a balanced set of rods. Obviously they were rebushed and they were rebored as well to make sure that they were perfectly round and ready for a new set of standard size bearings. So pretty cool. She looks pretty. She's ready to go in the case. All right, up next is gonna be the crankcase assembly. We're gonna start putting parts inside the case. Stay tuned to all my future chapters by subscribing to my YouTube channel. I hope you found this informative.